It's impossible for anyone to do what we do and not make any mistakes at all. You get people that walk into the gun store to fill out a 4473, which is the firearms transaction record. There's 100 ways a person can mess up this form, if not more than that. There are 100 different inputs that you actually put on the form. Even customers make mistakes when it comes to their name, their middle name or their first name. They reverse it. On that little box that says county, they put country. That does not mean that that person is going to get handed a firearm and they're not supposed to. They're not a prohibited person, and so their license should not get revoked just for that simple little minor mistake. I'm actually getting phone calls from gun stores all around the country, as far as like Oregon, as close as Houston. You're talking mom and pop gun stores. Grandparents, great-grandparents have owned this store, and all of a sudden now, ATF comes in and inspect them, find a little paperwork error. Maybe they've made the same type of error because they didn't catch it themselves, and they're wanting to shut them down. And this is the only way that I can help them is by filing a lawsuit, kind of being on the offensive instead of the defensive. I think we're assisting all the gun stores in the country in getting the ATF back into the box it need to be put back into. I'm so grateful that I was able to sit down and talk with TPPF. This organization is the one organization that I thought would actually stand up for Texans and stand up for all Americans in the United States and fight the federal government when they're overstepping their bounds.
Well, thank you very much for attending this panel that we have here this morning. With that, let me turn to my co-panelists. To my immediate, I guess, right, if you're looking at us, is Chris Boeck. Chris serves as the director for the Firearm Regulatory Accountability Coalition and a director for the American Suppressor Association Foundation. Chris is the general counsel for the Silencer Shop, the country's largest distributor of NFA-regulated firearms, and we will get to what the NFA is momentarily. Prior to joining Silencer Shop, Chris was a partner at Locke Lloyd, a full-service AmLaw 100 law firm. With the firm, he provided commercial and regulatory guidance to clients in the firearms industry, including federally licensed retailers, distributors, and manufacturers. I'll warn you right now, there are 3 lawyers on the stage, and it sounds like the setup for a joke, like 3 lawyers and a gun dealer walk into a bar. But, so I apologize in advance, but I think you're gonna love what these guys have to say. Chris is a member of the State Bar of Texas. He's admitted everywhere around Texas, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court. He has presented oral arguments before each of the federal district courts in Texas, as well as the Fifth Circuit. And had the honor of sitting, I'm jealous, had the honor of sitting at counsel's table in oral arguments before the Supreme Court when Justice Scalia sat on the bench. Chris graduated summa cum laude from the University of Texas at San Antonio and received his JD with honors from UT Austin. So Chris, thank you very much for being on our panel. Glad to have you here.
My pleasure.
The next man down on this stage I think needs no introduction. Mike Cargill has over 35 years of firearms experience in the military and private sector combined. He was born and raised in Florida, where after high school he joined the U.S. Army, achieving the rank of sergeant. As a licensed instructor, Michael has taught, are you sure this isn't a typo? Has taught more than 50,000 people the required material to obtain Texas private security and handgun licenses. Over more than 12 years, he has a greater than 99% student success rate. Michael is the owner of Central Texas Gun Works here in Austin, a U.S. federal firearms license dealer. He frequently speaks about firearms in person and on film, television, and radio, including the, and I wish we had thought of this, Come and Talk It radio show that he produces and hosts, because I promise you if you hadn't, our media team would love to have that for a podcast title. Finally, we have my colleague and friend, Autumn Patterson. Autumn is also a senior attorney here at TPPF. Before joining the foundation, Autumn was an associate in the Issues and Appeals Practice Group at Jones Day, where she focused on appellate advocacy and motions practice. Autumn began her career as a Solicitor General Fellow at the Office of the Attorney General for the state of Texas. She also previously served as a clerk for Justice Ava Guzman at the Supreme Court of Texas and Judge Andrew Oldham at the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. In 2021 and 2022, Autumn was named one of the best lawyers in America, ones to watch, for appellate practice. She earned her JD from Duke University School of Law, where she graduated magna cum laude. It's always good to have panelists that are smarter than you. While in law school, she served as co-president of the Federalist Society and interned for Judge Katharina Haynes on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and Judge Reed O'Connor on the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas. So you are in good hands here today with these panelists, and we very much thank you for attending. I know that we are counter-programmed against some great panels, but you came to the best one. So let's kind of lay the groundwork to start this discussion. And to do that, Mike, really a question for you, but I think also for you, Chris. Why do people want to sell guns? It's a heavily regulated industry. It's more regulated every day. It's a little, let's just say you're made a target by a number of people. Why sell guns?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, so the reason I started selling firearms, first of all, happy Independence Day.
Yeah, there you go.
Texas Independence Day. God, gotta love Texas. All right, so I started selling firearms mainly because of my parents. I wanted my parents, my family members, to be able to have the tools they need to protect themselves. My grandmother decided that at 70 years old, she was going to go back to college, get a college degree. She wanted to become a nurse. So at 70, she went to college. This one particular day, while my grandmother was sitting at a bus stop waiting for a bus to come, a guy came along, mugged her, and raped her. So I decided that I would, teach my family members, and give them the tools they need to protect themselves. So that's why I started selling firearms. That's why I started teaching classes. I wanted training. I want all my family members to have the training and all that stuff.
That's a great answer. So Dave Matheny, the CEO of Silencer Shop, he started the company because his son was born partially deaf. He's deaf in one ear. And Dave is an avid hunter. He participates in competitive shooting. He wanted to share his hobbies with his son and protect his good hearing in his one ear. So he tried to buy a silencer and discovered very quickly the complex regulatory paperwork you have to go through to purchase one. Discovered that the dealers he was trying to purchase from had no idea how to help him. In fact, one of the dealers actually went out of business during the process of the application. He had to start over. At the end of the process, he realized there was a need for a firearm dealer that focuses specifically on NFA regulations, NFA firearms, to help people overcome the hurdles that are put in place by the administrative state.
So let me back up. What is the NFA and why does it matter for this conversation?
Good question. National Firearms Act. So most firearms are regulated under the GCA, the Gun Control Act. There are a small number of NFA firearms, typically silencers, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, that are subject to additional regulations under the National Firearms Act. One of them being that if you want to buy one, you have to file what's called a Form 4, supporting documents, fingerprints, photograph, and complete a long questionnaire relating to your identity. And you have to ask permission. And these are items that typically cost between $500 and $1,500. So you're essentially paying for a fairly large purchase and then waiting currently 9 months for ATF to process that paperwork before you can figure out if you can even complete your purchase. So, yeah, that's the NFA.
Yeah, no, it's a big deal. And we'll be talking about short-barreled rifles later, right? Or maybe non-short-barreled rifles, as the case may be. All right, so Mike, why do people buy guns?
There's several reasons why people buy guns. A lot of people want to buy firearms for like hunting reasons. Some people want it for personal protection. A majority of my customers actually buy firearms because they want to collect, one of every gun that's out there. I have a customer that actually has 2 homes, somewhere in Texas, and he has
not in California.
He has one of every firearm, displayed inside the home because he just wants to do that. And
he has a home in a museum.
He has a home several homes in a museum.
There you go.
And so he does maybe 20,000 guns a month is what he will purchase, and so that's his hobby.
Okay, that's different than my hobbies, but good for him. And I was going to ask this question later, but I'll ask it now because it's really pertinent to this conversation. When it comes to selling guns and NFA items, the goal is to stop bad people from getting guns or children from getting guns, people who shouldn't have guns, who we don't want to have them as a society. I mean, when the Gun Control Act was passed, that was how it was pitched. This is how we're going to prevent bad people from obtaining firearms. And in terms of regulating firearms, that still seems to be the driving idea behind firearms regulations as far as I can tell. The ATF is charged primarily with those regulations, although the FBI is involved in certain ways. And Mike, again to you, and also to you, Chris, the industry's relationship with the ATF has changed over the years, hasn't it? And if it has, can you talk about what that change looks like, how it's gone from a collaborative, more of a collaborative system to more of an adversarial system, and how that's led to some of where we are today?
So originally, the gun stores were like the database for law enforcement. We're still that today. So we have a system where there's a trace on the gun that takes place. So let's say you purchase a firearm in the gun store, and your gun gets stolen or used in a crime, something like that. Well, the law enforcement is going to contact the manufacturer and say, hey, who'd you sell this gun to? Manufacturer's going to say, I sold it to this distributor. Distributor's going to say, hey, I sold it to this gun store. Then I'm going to say, hey, I sold to this person here. They'll do a little trace. And these things happen really quick because the gun store is a database. We actually maintain those records pretty much now forever inside the gun store. And a lot of us have, it's on a computer system. So I can get a phone call from the ATF right now, and I can tell them in a matter of seconds who I sold the gun to if they find that gun that was, that recovered, that was stolen or used in a crime or something like that. They've gone from originally, gun stores being that database, and also helping gun stores, assisting us with any issues that we have, any mistakes or anything like that. They've gone from doing that to now, where we are today, kind of shutting mom and pop gun stores down. So the ATF comes into the gun store, and they will do like a periodic check. And what they'll do is they actually go through every single piece of paperwork, every transaction in that gun store for the last 12 months.
And typically, how many transactions is that going to be?
So that can be, anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 transactions. That's just for a small gun store. So we average, anywhere between 10 and 20,000 transactions a year. We transfer. There's some days I can transfer 100 guns a day. And so they will walk to the gun store without any notice, which is fine, and go through an entire inspection. And with me, it takes them an entire week to do that. So I will have 5 agents who walk into the gun store, and I'll have to take that entire week for them to go through every piece of paperwork, make sure we haven't lost anything, which we never have, and just go over every line item, and there are 100 points on a 4473. So they can go through each 4473 for the entire year, all 100 points, 100 spots there to check for any mistakes whatsoever. And they've gotten to the point where originally it was to say, hey, gun stores, this is where you're making your mistakes. You're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong. Let me show you a better way of doing this. Mm-hmm. They've gone from doing that to now saying, hey, under this current administration, we're just going to go ahead and close you down. And like I said in the video, if someone walks to the gun store and fill out that 4473, the firearms transaction record, and there's a little spot in there that says county, and instead the person will put country in there. That's a very common mistake. And if you miss that mistake, they're actually using that as justification to close down the gun stores around the country. And so, you're having mom and pop gun stores who have been open for decades. They passed this business down from their great grandparents down to their grandsons and so on and so forth. And now they're shutting them down just for those simple small errors.
And I know how, it sounds insane, but we've heard from gun shops, Chris, I know you've talked to some, all around the country this is happening to. And consider this, if a 4473 has 100 data points on it and you've got 10,000 4473s, that's 1 million data points that they're auditing. And every mistake is technically a violation of the Gun Control Act. Now we'll get into our lawsuit and kind of the theories of the case here in a little while, but that's why I asked the question about why people sell guns, Chris, is because the regulatory burden is rather high. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys experienced with Silencer Shop?
Well, yeah, and if we're going to talk about the relationship between ATF and industry, we have to talk about the zero tolerance policy.
Yep.
And that's a new policy implemented by the current administration. And what it does is it essentially has 5 categories of conduct that the ATF considers zero tolerance. If you have one example of that type of conduct, game over. We're going to revoke your license, and when you have your license revoked as a licensed gun dealer, you're shutting down your business.
For the rest of your life.
Rest of your life.
Hey, you can never get a license again.
That's right. Can't even join another company to try to join their license. So some of these categories, in fact, most of the categories, when you look at them at face value, they seem relatively benign. For example, one of the categories is falsifying a firearm record.
Sure.
That makes sense. You wouldn't expect to be able to falsify firearm records and then keep your license.
Sure.
The problem is in the application and the enforcement. And what we've seen is that, talking about missing a field on a 4473, one of the 100 data points, we see people just make simple clerical, typographical, honest, good faith mistakes. And when you're dealing in volumes of tens of thousands of transactions and hundreds of data points, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you're going to make a mistake. So we're seeing classifications of honest mistakes like that being considered falsification of a document.
Yeah, and that's the game that's being played. So they'll come, I mean, for instance, this is a good one. So Nate and I talked to a gun store in Arizona that was being put out of business, and the inspector came in, and as Mike said, you're required to turn your records over, I think, immediately to him. And they had collected they only did it on paper, which I think may have been a bit of a mistake, but they only did it on paper, and so they would have a file for January, February, March, April. And for every record that wasn't perfectly chronological within that month, they wrote it up as a separate violation. So they came out and said, am I getting this right, Nate? So they came out and they said, this store has 1,250 violations of the Gun Control Act. Well, my goodness, they probably should go out of business. And then you come to realize that those violations were actually for having a piece of paper behind another piece of paper when it should have been in front of it in chronological order. And I know this sounds crazy. I know it sounds like we're up here making this up, but we've talked to a lot of stores around the country, and that is what is happening, and that's why TPPF has gotten involved in this fight. But it's not the only fight we're involved in, is it, Autumn?
No, it is not.
My colleague down here just filed another case against, you're against ATF on that?
Yes, along with the Department of Justice
Department
and
of Justice.
others.
Autumn, can you tell us about that other case a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So this case is a challenge to the recent stabilizing brace rule. So to provide a little bit of background, as you heard from Chris, some weapons are subjected to additional regulations under the NFA. And so that means to possess them, you need to apply for approval, you need to get a tax stamp, things like that. And one weapon that falls into that category is a short-barreled rifle. And part of how the statute defines a rifle is that it is designed and intended to be fired from the shoulder. And so those weapons you need to register, pay the tax stamp, and if you possess a short barrel rifle that isn't registered, it can subject you to very serious penalties. Just possession, 10 years in prison, over $250,000 fine, so very serious.
That's pretty serious. And what is the barrel length that determines whether it's short? 16 inches?
It's 16 inches.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And the NFA was passed in 1934. It was targeting sawed-off shotguns and things of that nature. So very helpful context, I think, of kind of why you might think Congress passed this. So that brings us to what a stabilizing brace is. So in 2012, an individual invented the stabilizing brace for large AR-15 style pistols. So he was at a gun range with his friend, a disabled vet who was struggling to control his weapon due to his injuries. And so he actually had to stop firing the pistol to be safe. And so he made a brace that could be strapped to the large pistol and to the forearm. So when you shoot, you have additional control and some more, it's normally good. If people are firing firearms, you want them to be accurate, so they hit the target.
And be able to control them.
Yes, it's a good thing. And so he came up with a prototype to help his friend, and he sent it to ATF to make sure he didn't want to get in trouble, that it would be okay. And the ATF said, this does not transform the pistol into a short barrel rifle. It is still a pistol. You're not intending to fire it from the shoulder. It will be braced to the forearm. And so as time went on over the past decade, stabilizing braces have proliferated in different types of designs, as a lot of people found that they were helpful to use to enable them to shoot their AR-15 style pistols more accurately, safe. Obviously, people have different physical capabilities, so a lot of people found these to be helpful. And estimates, it varies how many have been sold, The Congressional Research Service report said 10 to 40 million of these have been purchased. ATF is not willing to concede that. They put the number at closer to 3 to 7 million, but they think some of the same people are buying them. But even ATF will concede that at least 1.4 million Americans have a pistol with a stabilizing brace attached.
Well, and to put this in context, nearly every major rifle manufacturer started selling product across the country with these stabilizing braces attached, and they did that in reliance on ATF's approval of the product.
Mm-hmm. Right, and as different prototypes and different companies produced them, they would often send it to ATF asking for approval, and ATF said, you know, this is still a pistol. It is not designed or intended to be fired from the shoulder. Occasionally they might say, oh, this one little feature, you need to remove it, but they were approving these devices. And that brings us kind of to the present day. So regulations have been threatened and proposed, but January 31st of this year, ATF passed a rule saying that a stabilizing brace does transform a pistol into a short barrel rifle, which means that at least according to their own numbers, 1.4 million Americans are guilty of a felony that could send them to prison for 10 years.
Just by mere possession, overnight.
Yeah, just possession, just mere possession. But they say, oh, don't worry. If you comply with this enforcement discretion scheme we are creating, then we won't penalize you. But the reality is still they're saying that all of these individuals are felons who could be prosecuted today, and it's only in their enforcement discretion that they're not being prosecuted. And so we are challenging that on a couple of bases. And the most obvious one probably is a Second Amendment violation, that this infringes on the right to keep and bear arms for self-defense in pretty obvious ways. And then also what I think should concern everybody is this government overreach to have unelected officials say what the law is and to transform the law to make people felons. It's really, really quite shocking. And contrary to what our founders wanted, right? They knew that you would have tyranny if you combine the powers into one branch. So they separated them in Article 1 and gave the executive power to the president, the judicial power to the judiciary, and legislative power to Congress. And so this completely trumps that, as you're having someone rewrite the statute with retroactive effects. So we're also claiming that it violates the structural protections in the Constitution. And then finally, that it also just exceeds the agency's statutory authority to do this, that they don't have the power to rewrite the definitions and determine what constitutes a crime to penalize more people. So that's general summary of the case, and we're very excited about it.
Well, and there are some serious dangers with this rule. I mean, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I would poll the audience and say, how many of you were aware of the difference between a pistol versus a rifle versus a short barrel rifle? How many of you were aware of this rule change and the fact that we're actually in the middle of a 120-day period? Right now, we're already a month into it, during which time you have a limited period to register your now short barrel rifles or become a felon on May 31st.
And be subject to 10 years in prison and $250,000
right.
worth of fines. It's a serious felony. Yeah.
And I mean, it's something you can just go and buy. Even today, you can go and buy a pistol stabilizing brace. It's separate, you know, it's not as though you'll necessarily be on notice that in buying that or attaching this accessory to your gun that you are creating a short barrel rifle. So a lot of these people aren't on notice and very much have that concern of not even being aware of what has happened.
So I think this hits on a larger theme of what's going on these days. And it's not just in the gun context. I think it's in many, many contexts, which is this regulatory kind of whipsaw that industries go through. I'm not an economist, but when you talk to economists, what they'll say is that businesses and individuals thrive the most when they have regulatory certainty. When you have rule of law, I know what the rules are, I can figure out how to comply with them, I can live my life and go on. What we have now, because of the expansion of the administrative state, that is beholden to politicians with very distinct, very aggressive agendas, is the rules change depending on who's in the Oval Office. And I would imagine, and Chris and Mike, if you can speak to this a little bit, that whipsaw effect is a bit of a challenge when all you're trying to do is run a business. How has that been from the inside?
Well, so that's why we've gone forward with the bump stock lawsuit. I don't know if anyone heard of a bump stock before. Okay, so
Mike's the only guy I've ever met who likes to sue the government more than I do. So,
I have a case. It's Michael Cargill versus the Department of Justice, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is the bump stock lawsuit against the federal government, which, in essence, this case defines what a machine gun is. And it also talks about the government and agencies that cannot create law. And I'll let the attorneys talk about the Chevron deference because I don't know what that means. So basically saying that, government agencies within our federal government cannot create or write law. That's Congress's job to do that. So this case is very important. It's not just about bump stocks. It's about the government. It's about the EPA. It's about OSHA. It's about what's the group in Atlanta, that decides they want, who is it?
The CDC.
CDC. It's about the CDC.
Yeah.
They say, hey, we want everyone to wear a mask. It's mandatory for you to wear a mask. What if OSHA comes out and says, you know what, ladies, we're going to ban high heels because we think high heels are bad for your back. So we're going to ban them, and you're gonna have to turn them in. And if you, and if you possess one, we're going to make you a felon overnight. So that's basically what we're saying. That you can't do that. You're an agency within the federal government. Congress has to create a law, has to go through both houses. President has to sign it, and then that's how things become law. And so all these cases that we brought forward are about that. And I'll let the attorneys talk about that overreach as far as the Chevron deference and things of that nature.
Yeah, Mike, I'm really glad you brought up that case because it's a huge case. It has tremendous impacts. One of the key rulings from that opinion from the Fifth Circuit was that when you have a criminal statute, separate from other types of regulation, when you have a criminal statute, if the statute itself is ambiguous, if it's not clear, you defer to the defendant. And in that case, that's us, that's the public, as opposed to deferring to the agency's interpretation. That's relevant in particular to the pistol brace ruling because the foundation of the pistol brace ruling was ATF's position that the definition of rifle under the GCA was ambiguous, wasn't clear. In fact, when they published their proposed rule, one of the things that happens is people have the opportunity to comment. One of the comments was, the definition of rifle is clear. It doesn't need to be explained. And ATF unequivocally came back and said, no, it's not clear. We disagree. We think it needs clarification. Right there, we have a criminal statute that they are saying is unclear, and it's up to them to tell the world what it means. I think that your case, Mike, is going to have a profound impact on all of the rulings, all of the lawsuits relating to the pistol brace. And while we're on this topic, really quick, I want to give a quick shout out to FRAC, the Firearms Regulatory Accountability Coalition. They have a parallel lawsuit relating to the pistol brace, challenging the pistol brace, and we're all working together on this. They've done a tremendous job. They've garnered 25 states. 25 states Attorney General have joined that lawsuit, so we have half the country fighting that challenge in North Dakota. And we actually recently just received an amicus brief from, I think it was 33 members of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives in support of the challenge in that case. So they've really stepped up, and I wanted to mention that as well.
Absolutely.
And if you're following the bump stock lawsuit, so the Fifth Circuit has actually ruled on that case, and we've won. We won in the Fifth Circuit in en banc. So that ruling happened on January the 6th, no less. January the 6th. I'll let that sink in for a minute. And so, so they came back. We won that case, and now the government has 90 days from January the 6th to appeal to the Supreme Court. Now, they missed one of the deadlines, and that was the deadline of February 27th to appeal before the Fifth Circuit released their mandate back down to the lower court. So now the Fifth Circuit says, hey, this is what the court has said. You need to carry out our wishes. It's gone back down to the lower court, so now I have 3 demands of the court that I'm going to release to my attorneys to do later on this week, and I'll let you hear about that later. And so, since the government has not appealed this decision, I'm hoping that we can get them to appeal by my 3 demands that I'm going to instruct my attorneys to actually send to the court. So we'll see what happens with that. So hopefully they will appeal, and we'll push this case toward the Supreme Court, because right now bump stocks are legal in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi.
Fifth Circuit.
right, the Fifth Circuit. And so unless this goes to the Supreme Court rules on it, then it's only going to stay in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. It's not going to affect the rest of the country. And I can't see the government coming in and saying they're just going to allow Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi to have bump stocks, and only Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi to say that you can't create a right law in the Fifth Circuit. Mm-hmm. And that's why I got with TPPF to come up with the other lawsuit, because I'm throwing all these lawsuits against the federal government. I need to protect my business. I need to play chess here, not checkers. So that's why we came back and said, you know what, I need to protect the gun store and my federal firearms license, because if I don't do that, then the government can come after me and my business and shut me down just by a simple little paperwork error. Say, you know what, we're going to walk into your store and we're going to inspect you and see if we can find any mistakes whatsoever and shut you completely down. So I said, let's get on the offensive, not the defensive, and let's take it to them. Yeah. So that's why we did this lawsuit.
Well, Mike, as an attorney, I think, imagine that. Imagine if I submit a brief to a court and it has a typo, that I lose my law license, right? And we have layers and layers of editing at TPPF, but occasionally something does slip through, and we are all human, and we do our best to comply with these laws and comply with whatever rules we have to comply with, but we're not perfect. It's an interesting time because, as far as I can tell, firearm sales are as robust as ever. Is that fair to say? We still have a Second Amendment, and the Supreme Court recently just strengthened the Second Amendment tremendously in the Bruen decision. So, Autumn, if you can talk about Bruen a little bit, just to kind of set up the difference between popularity, Second Amendment protections, Supreme Court doing its job, versus a regulatory state that is launching every little attack, death by 1,000 cuts attack on gun stores and firearm sales that they can, to try to contravene what is really a societal movement in favor of firearm ownership.
Yeah, absolutely. So this past year, the Supreme Court issued the Bruen decision. Prior to that, under Heller and McDonald, the Supreme Court did recognize the right for individuals to own firearms for self-defense purposes in their home. But a lot of lower courts did not really respect that ruling, and in various ways cut back on it as much as they could to try to limit that right to, self-defense rights in the home, okay, and that's it. And so in Bruen, the question is whether there was any right to publicly carry firearms, and the Supreme Court held that there was a right to publicly carry firearms, that the right to self-defense in the Second Amendment, to keep and bear, it indicates publicly, so that you do have a right, and you can't create a licensing scheme that really is just denying everyone of that right. That ordinary self-defense purposes is sufficient to have the right to bear arms, and even talked about how it was not, that it was a right that needed to be respected. Mm-hmm. And then significantly, the court also set forth a standard that lower courts are to apply going forward regarding gun regulations. And that is that if a regulation covers conduct that is covered by the Second Amendment, if it's trying to limit or restrict a person's ability to possess a firearm that facilitates self-defense, even if that firearm didn't exist at the founding, even if it's a modern firearm, it's presumptively protected by the Second Amendment, and that the burden is on the government to affirmatively prove that nonetheless that restriction is justified by history and tradition. And so the government needs to go and look at the history of regulations in this country around when the Second Amendment was ratified. They kind of said some other history may or may not be relevant, some things might be decided, but to point out that that this was understood to be an acceptable regulation under the Second Amendment. And just putting that burden on the government is huge, to affirmatively have to justify these regulations. And so you should see changes, but yet you see the ATF continuing to regulate. And in the stabilizing brace rule, they actually just put Bruen in a footnote and said they didn't think it changed anything. So I think you're going to see a lot more cases, a lot more regulations as they're kind of trying to push the boundaries of that and see what lower courts are willing to do.
Well, yeah, and I mean, the Second Amendment is a constitutional right. It is a co-equal constitutional right with all other rights in that document. And if you imagine, say a war on bookstores under the First Amendment, where they were trying to put bookstores out of business, or if you possessed a certain book, you were a felon and subject to 10 years in prison. It kind of highlights the stakes in this fight, and it is certainly an ongoing fight.
That's right.
Always and forever. Please.
Yeah, well, just think about, here you're talking about the typographical errors and things like that. What if someone was denied the right to vote because they made a typographical error?
Right.
It's just the differences. It's very much treating it as a second-class right.
Yeah, it's a first-class right. It's also a backstop for all of the other rights. For in the American experiment of a government for the people, by the people, the power to keep and bear arms is a critical component of that. And I think we can engage in discussions on firearms regulations and gun safety and buttressing the existing statutes. But when we do so, Bruin gives us the tools to analyze what we're doing under the context of history and tradition. And so as we chip away potentially at that component of that core American value, we will do it with respect to history and tradition.
Yep.
I like when people say that, well, back in, when they wrote the Constitution, it was only about muskets. I love when they say that. And then I have to remind people, you just take a scroll down Congress Avenue here in Austin, Texas, and there's a statue of a young lady, Angelina Eberly. You get a chance, take a look at that statue and read the description about Angelina Eberly. And back in the 1860s, there was a general that decided that he did an order, sent a military detachment to Austin, Texas to take the records from Austin. And if they were successful in stealing these records from Austin, Austin would not be the capital of Texas that it is today. So Angelina Eberly saw what was going on, and she had a cannon. And Angelina fired a cannon at those soldiers and sent them running, and they were able to recover those records, and that is why Austin, Texas is still Austin, Texas, the capital of Texas, because Angelina Eberly, a female, had a cannon and used it. Just remember that.
And to the extent we're talking about increasing rates of gun ownership and stuff, I also did want to note, you are seeing increasing numbers of women wanting to own guns. The Wall Street Journal said that from 2019 to April of 2021, of new gun buyers, 3.5 million were women, 4 million were men. And of those new gun owners, 21% were Black, 19% were Hispanic. So, the desire to protect yourself and family spans demographics.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gets at the last point that I wanted to make, because we are about solutions here at TPPF. We enjoy suing people. We enjoy getting bad laws taken off the books, but we can't always just be on defense. As I alluded to earlier, in the end of the day, we want good guys to have guns and bad guys not to have guns. I think that's all of our goals, at least in this room. Chris, Mike, Autumn, what can we be doing differently today? What should we be focused on today to make sure bad guys aren't getting guns? It feels like we're distracted by all these other fights and all these other battles. What should we be doing?
Sure, and there are a number of options. I think you first start with enforcing the laws that we already have on the books. You look at what happened at MSU. The shooter there had a prior conviction or a prior prosecution for a gun violation. He pled it down to a misdemeanor and was no longer considered a felon. As a result of that, he was able to purchase lawfully firearms in the future. That's an example of enforcement of existing laws that could have prevented something tragic. We also have ways to buttress the NICS system, encourage communication between state departments and the FBI, so that the NICS system, when people walk into a gun store and buy a firearm, they have to undergo a background check. The owner contacts NICS, and NICS only has the ability to see what it can see. So if we have better connections between state agencies communicating their records with NICS, that's another way to improve background checks as they currently exist.
And I wish that law enforcement, instead of the ATF actually trying to focus on shutting the gun stores down. I wish they really would work more with the gun stores. Do you know that if someone walks into a gun store here today, this is 2023, and they want to sell a gun to a gun store. Hey, you have a gun, you want to sell it to the gun store. Do you know that gun store, there's no way for that gun store to figure out if that gun's been reported stolen? There's no way. So I actually profile people to determine if I'm going to purchase a gun from them or not. You know, if it's a past customer, I'll purchase a gun from them. They have an LTC, I'll purchase the gun from them. I have to profile them to determine whether I'm going to buy this gun or not. If this person looks like, they look like they stole that gun, I'm not buying it from them. Because there's no way that the gun store can figure out. I've been trying to get our local law enforcement, even DPS, to work with the gun stores here in Texas to verify this. If someone walks into the gun store to purchase a firearm and they have a license to carry a handgun, the gun store can type their number and expiration date into a website and verify that LTC is still valid. We should have some type of system for that to verify if a gun by typing the serial number to see if that gun has been reported stolen. I'm supposed to contact 911 and wait for a police officer to show up to run the serial number of a gun. That is not what the 911 system is supposed to be used for.
No.
And so I've been trying to work with our elected officials. Currently, right now, this legislative session, they're focusing on anti-gun bills. There are 100 anti-gun bills that have been filed before the Texas legislature this session. Instead of working on the things of that nature to help the gun stores to get, to make sure that guns do not wind up in the hands of the wrong people and things of that nature. So we can verify this information in the gun store. They're working with us, then we can eliminate a lot of our problems.
Well, and the last point I'll make, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A. You had talked earlier about the corrosion of kind of trust and kind of honor between ATF and gun stores. And you mentioned that if a gun was used in a crime, they could come to you and figure out who bought it. And to me, that's important. Those relationships are important. It's not that you would deny them the information because you're suing them, but if you have a good relationship, it just changes kind of the flavor of that. How often would law enforcement contact you about a gun they found? Was that common? Was it?
So it does happen because the number one way that criminals get their hands on guns nowadays, especially in Austin, Texas, is from vehicles. So people leave their guns in their vehicles. Maybe you have a key fob, and for some reason you sit on the key fob and you unlock your vehicle, don't even realize it, and so your vehicle's unlocked and your gun's in the center console, the glove box, under the seat, and that's what criminals know. So if people lock their gun, lock them up.
Yep.
Don't leave them in your vehicle, and we won't have that problem. But those some of the ways there.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. So we've worked hard to give you kind of an overview of what's going on, why we're doing it, why these fights matter. But I'm sure we haven't answered all of your questions. I see we haven't answered all of your questions. So do we have a microphone for Q&A? Clayton? So let me see. I guess we'll start with the gentleman in the back since you're closest to Clayton.
Hi, thank you. There's been a lot of reported boating accidents since this ruling came out from the ATF. This is for Chris or Autumn. What do you think the outcome's going to be after the ruling, after the 120 days, if there's no decision from the courts? What's going to happen with the millions of folks that do have a pistol brace?
Well, we should be getting a decision before then. So in our case, the court has said that we filed a lot of papers really quickly. DOJ is a little angry with us at the moment. But
she knows all the moves.
Yes, they are. DOJ will be on this Friday filing their cert reply to our motion for preliminary relief. And the court said that it will issue a decision on or before March 24th. And so we will see what happens at that point. But there are other lawsuits that are proceeding, bringing some of the same claims, some other ones. So I think we'll just kind of have to see how it plays out and among the different courts.
Yeah, the ATF has really left the public in a precarious situation. We've got this limited time period. We don't know what's going to happen. I'm confident that one of the lawsuits will result in a preliminary injunction ruling of some sort. But we don't know what's going to happen once that case is appealed all the way up. Plus, there's the variable of legislation. There's a push to make these types of rifles, short barrel rifles, by legislation, by statute, in which case we'll be back where we started. So There is currently a 120-day period. You can tell your friends if you have a braced firearm, ATF is allowing you to register it without paying the normal $200 tax stamp. So there is an opportunity there, whatever happens.
And see, I'm not an attorney. I can't give legal advice, but what I've instructed my customers is, get the stuff ready. Do your paperwork, go to Silencer Shop, get into their system, do your fingerprints, photo, get all that stuff ready to go, and just wait and see what happens with these other cases as they move forward. If we get an injunction, then we're good to go. We can hold it. If you don't get an injunction, as we get closer to May 31st, then you might want to hit, that green button and submit that paperwork to the ATF.
Suddenly turn into a felon like Cinderella. You just, bam.
And there are other options, but of course all of them involve money or restrictions of your rights. You can also replace the barrel with a longer barrel to make it a longer rifle, and things of that nature. But if once you register it too, you're going to be subject to additional ongoing restrictions on your ability to travel with the gun, your ability to loan it to a family member who can have access to it. So it's still a burden on your right.
And the simplest way is to separate the brace from the rifle. So if you take the brace off and just leave the buffer tube on, like I said, I'm not an attorney. I can't give you legal advice. You separate the buffer tube, the brace from the buffer tube, and then put the brace somewhere else, maybe in storage or something like that. Then that may suffice.
Okay. Other question? This lady up here in the red.
Hi, my name's Bailey O'Donnell, and I'm a Sumner Scholar from Texas Wesleyan University. My campus is a gun-free campus because we're a private university, so our school got to choose. And as one of the few conservative students on campus, I get a lot of questions personally about my opinion on guns. What's something that I can tell my classmates on a gun-free campus about how they're important and how you can be safe and why we need to maintain our Second Amendment rights?
Turn that over to the guy who's taught 50,000 people in firearm safety and personal safety.
I would love to come out to the university and talk to your group if you have a group that's there. So definitely reach out to me, and I'll be glad to go out there. Currently, right now, there's a court case that was won in December, and the state of Texas decided to not appeal this case to where all 18, 19, 20-year-olds can actually get a licensed carry handgun and carry a handgun. Now, unfortunately, that's only for your public institutions like University of Texas, Texas State, Texas Tech, Texas A&M, your public institutions. So if those 18, 19, 20-year-olds get their LTC, they can carry in the public institution inside the building, concealed only. So you don't have that option because you're a private university. Private universities can opt out of the campus carry. So your only option would be to make sure you're not violating the policy of the university as far as pepper spray, tasers, stun guns, and things of that nature. Travel in groups, use a code word meaning that when you're getting ready to, let's say you're leaving the library late at night, going back to the dorm, home, whatever, have a code word, a little word that you can send in a text message to let someone know there's an emergency, I need to kick a plan into place, I need assistance, I need help. Travel with someone, don't travel by yourself. And unfortunately, little things like that, and I can go into it even more detail, but those are going to be the only options until we're able to get campus carry for private institutions. Because I think private institutions, that's going to be the next step. Unfortunately, there's not enough political power out there right now to push any gun bills, pro-gun bills right now, what I've been told to the this legislative session, so we may have to wait to a different session.
Maybe even wait a while.
Thank you so much. I'm Leslie Fitzpatrick, and I'm an attorney as well. I'm licensed to carry. And, back in June of 2022, in a 6-3 ruling, the United States Supreme Court slapped the EPA on the hand for doing the same thing that the ATF is doing, making laws when they're a regulatory agency. So are we going to be relitigating that with a federal agency once again trying to make a rule of law?
Are you referring to the West Virginia?
Yes.
So that is one of the issues in the case, is whether the agency is exceeding the statutory authority in making the law. So that is one of the claims. with the exceeding statutory authority.
Yeah, and I think, Leslie, with the case you're referring to, it adopted the major questions doctrine, essentially deferring to the legislature when it's a major question. And I think in this case, when we're making potentially millions of people felons overnight, it may be a major question.
Right. Well, and that's where there's a possibility of expanding it too, because there the focus, a lot of it was on the economic consequences of the rule, and here this rule has importance to individual rights and things of that nature.
Well, and the bad thing is that so they keep doing the same thing over and over again. It's where we have to relitigate the same type of issues, but in the meantime, we're being forced to give the left our gun information. And so they're putting together a list of people that have firearms, and eventually that case is probably going to be ruled that it's not, they're out of their lane again. So what can we do as gun owners? I mean, yes, right now we have this deadline, but we're giving these agencies our information that at some point later on, the Supreme Court may say no again. How do we get that information back once we've given the federal government the information? Now they know that I have a weapon. What is my recourse?
I don't think you're gonna. I am a lawyer, and what I would say is, obviously you always want to comply with the law, but I wouldn't comply early. I would comply, on the last day that I could, and still remain within the bounds of the law, because I do think we will see these injunctions. I do think that these lawsuits, your lawsuit, will achieve that result,
Yeah,
and then you won't have to turn that information over to begin with.
Right, that's part of the basis for seeking that's normally lawsuits take a very long time, years and years, and that's part of the basis for seeking the preliminary relief, is because the bell can't be unrung, you can't undo the harm. And in addition, here we're talking about a fundamental right, so every day that goes by, you're being deprived of your Second Amendment right, which is an irreparable harm.
Yeah.
Well, and that's great advice for people to wait until they are forced to comply.
Yeah. I mean, you're not required to turn it over until day 120, so I probably wouldn't do so. Sir, you've been waiting a long time. I'll get to you.
Yes, my name is Al Wiley. I'm from East Texas, Piney Woods, and I have a question that relates to the situation with the bump stocks. There's another product that was put out a couple of years ago that ATF single-handedly ruled upon, and that's something called the forced reset trigger that goes into an AR platform. Arguably, it turns that platform into into a machine gun, such as the argument was made that a bump stock does the same thing. Now, unlike the bump stock, and this is where I'd like to know if there's litigation in progress on this, unlike the bump stock, ATF determined unilaterally that this forced reset trigger in and of itself is a machine gun. Not a part of one, not something that could turn an AR into one. It is by itself a machine gun by classification, meaning if you own it, you are a felon unless you get a stamp. Of course, you can't get a stamp for it unless it goes into a gun, but without even being in the gun, it cannot be possessed. So my question, I guess, is on the specifics, is it legal and appropriate for a non-weapon to be described in terms of it being a fully operational weapon for legal purposes? And would the lawsuits that are currently in the system, like for example for the bump stock, would the Supreme Court ruling be broad enough, do you think, that it would cover other things like that, just like we're hoping that the Supreme Court decisions would be broad enough to address the issue of ATF overreach?
I'll ask Chris to do.
Sure.
You're a gun parts guy.
Oh, yeah. So one of the distinctions between the FRT triggers, and this also applies to parts of silencers, is that there are certain parts that really can only be used for an item that is already regulated. So for example, with the FRT trigger, it turns a regular rifle into something akin to a machine gun in the sense that it can be fired faster. There are silencer parts that really have no use except in a silencer. The distinction with, say, a pistol brace, for example, you take the pistol brace off of one type of rifle that has a short barrel, and you put it on a different type of rifle that has a long barrel, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is not an NFA-regulated item because it has a long barrel. It's not a short barrel rifle. So that's one distinction. The Cargill case was excellent. One of the things that they repeated, though, in the opinion was that it was a non-mechanical bump stock that was at issue. So that is a distinction between the FRT triggers that do have a mechanical component to them. There is plenty of litigation out there. We'll just have to see how that shakes out.
Okay. Sir?
My name is Dave Zinker, and my question related to, well, one thing that you said, Matt, you referred to the activity underway as a death by 1,000 cuts, and I concur. One of the things that I'm very concerned about, and I think that you support it, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, is convention of the states, because as I understand it, Texas has gone along with this nonsense. But in any case, what the concern is that there are committees underway right now whose purpose is to clarify the Second Amendment. Clarify the Second Amendment. And like you were saying, sir, the lady who fired the cannon at the guys trying to take the paperwork out of Austin, the only clarification that we need is what you were saying, ma'am, is at the time. One of the things that those folks say is they want to clarify it in that the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia, which they want to use to obviate personal right to carry. So I guess I solicit your comments regarding that, sir.
Well, we don't have an official position on the Convention of States at TPPF. What I will say is that the upside of this volume of litigation that's going on right now, and it's a lot, and it has to be a lot, is that you will get I hope, a lot of clarification when it's finished. I think Bruin provided unexpected clarification for us in a lot of ways. These other cases, we don't know which ones. Hopefully ours, I think, will also reach the Supreme Court, and we'll get additional clarification. And so even though the law is slow and sometimes narrow and sometimes iterative, the gift that we've been given by the regulatory state is the ability to do a lot of clarifying very quickly, even though the volume of litigation is high. And so my hope is that we will get that, let's say 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, when all this finally unwinds its way through the courts.
And on that point, with regard to Mike's successful victory in the Fifth Circuit, again, that's a tremendous ruling. There is still a question as to whether ATF, which lost at the Fifth Circuit, is going to take the opportunity to appeal to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of discussion that they may choose strategically not to do so, even though they lost, even though it leaves 3 states out of the union that can have bump stocks. And the reason being that there is a good Supreme Court right now. We've seen excellent creation of law after Heller in the Bruin case. So at this point, time is not on our side in that sense because we're seeing an attempt to delay, right? So the answer is, frankly, vote.
Oh, yeah.
Vote Republican.
Yeah, elections have consequences.
Yeah.
They truly do. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Are there more questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Bruce Elbert from Georgetown. I wasn't aware of the Bruin decision, which had to do, I guess, with anywhere in the country you would be able to carry. Is that what that is? Does that mean if I travel from Texas to another state, i.e. California, they can't keep me from carrying?
So that case dealt specifically with a New York law that was being challenged. So it said that the licensing regime in New York was invalid and violated the Second Amendment. Why it's significant, though, is it did recognize, have the Supreme Court saying that there is a public right to carry. And so the question is just whether the regulations in other states that infringe or burden that right, whether they can be justified or not. So you're seeing more litigation now in other states based on Bruin to see whether those restrictions can be justified or not. New York was one of the states that had a stricter public carry license that was effectively preventing anyone from public carry in New York. So it depends on the specific state law and the challenges that will arise to that.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have a license to carry, but I understand it's not necessary to have those to prove that you have a license to carry. What is the value in going through the certification process to affirm that you have done all of these rules and regulations, you know them and everything, and then not have to show it if you are stopped?
All right, so currently right now we have constitutional carry. So pretty much anyone, as long as you fit in a certain criteria, you step foot in Texas, you can carry a handgun or a rifle, without having a license or anything like that. And rifles have been like that since 1869. You've been able to openly carry a rifle in Texas since 1869. Now, the benefits of having a license to carry handgun is, so one, you've taken a class, you learn what the laws are, you know where you can, where you cannot take the handgun or a long gun, you know use of force and deadly force, when you can threaten someone with a gun, when you can legally shoot someone with a gun. That's important because constitutional carry went into effect in Texas on September the 1st of 2021. And so that's September, October, November, December, 4 months of 2021. Well, guess what? Do you know that unlawfully carrying weapon convictions in Texas increased by 500% that year? Because people stopped coming to class, stopped taking the license to carry handgun course, and they weren't learning what the laws are, what the laws were, so they started getting convicted. There are several reasons why it's good to have a license to carry handgun. One, any interaction that you have with law enforcement, you get stopped by police. Now there are several reasons why a person can't be in possession of a firearm, but with a license to carry handgun, they know your background check's already been done. You're an outstanding citizen. They don't have to worry about looking in your criminal history and determining whether or not if you can or cannot be in possession of that firearm. Two, if you're driving through a school zone, do you know when you're going through a school zone within 1,000 feet of a school, that is an elementary school, middle school, high school, you're actually violating a federal law for being within 1,000 feet of a school with any weapons at all. It's a no-gun zone, unless you have your license to carry a handgun. With your license from the state you live in, you're exempt of the federal law. So they can bring federal charges against you within 1,000 feet of a school if you have to use your gun for self-defense. When you go to the airport, there's an elected official in Texas, totally forgot and went to the airport.
There's also an ex-Dallas Cowboys coach,
Was
but
he?
we won't get into that.
All right, so you know the story. Okay, so in Texas, we have that if you go to the airport and you forget and you have your gun in your carry-on luggage, you have your license to carry handgun, you can say, oopsie, my bad, I have a license to carry handgun. They will walk into your vehicle and let you lock the gun up in your vehicle if you forget and leave it in your carry-on luggage. If you do not have a license, that is a felony, 2 to 10 years in jail. All right, and it's also good to have a license if you're going to go out and drink. And arguably,
All right, I need some explanation.
if you don't have a license and you go out and you have a drink, you have a handgun, you get stopped by police, you're not supposed to have any alcohol in your system at all. Now, this is something they did at the very last second of the 2021 legislative session where they jumbled everything up. And when they came out, it was approved and passed the way things were moved around and everything. If you have an LTC, you could be at least 0.08. Without the license, 0 is the limit. You cannot be intoxicated at all. So several reasons why it's good to keep your license and make sure you renew that license and come back to class and do a refresher course and learn the laws, learn more of the laws.
Great. I need, is it a quick question? I need to wrap this up. Sorry, it's live streaming. That way they can hear you on the live stream.
When you go through the licensing, at least when I did, you're required to fire your firearm, and it's going to allow a lot of people to understand how effective they are or how responsible they are of firing that, and so it's a little bit of a gut check with regard to whether you're going to use it.
So a lot of people don't know how to hold the firearm, don't know how to stand with it, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's good to come to class and stand with an instructor to learn that stuff and get that evaluation.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Please join us in the Zlotnick Ballroom at 12:30 for lunch. Our keynote remarks will be delivered by Lieutenant Governor Patrick. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Autumn, very much.
Thank
Hope
you.
you enjoyed the panel.